Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that likes to focus on local issues, provincial issues, national, international. And you know what? A lot of international issues really heat up on the local front. People get pretty worked up about some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And my co-host with the most, John Jurisic, never gets too worked up. He never gets angry. Always interesting things to say. But boy, there is a lot of conflict out there, John.
Yeah, disturbingly so, Robin. I mean, what is happening to the world? What's happening to our community? It used to be we disagree with each other on stuff. Okay. Now it's like we disagree with each other. I'm scared of getting beat up. Anyway, this new legislation, for example, to eliminate short-term rentals in British Columbia is certainly getting lots of attention. By the spring, apartment buildings like the Janyan in Victoria will not be able to provide short-term rentals. This is to increase the long-term rentals and condos for sale in the marketplace. Some of these rentals are handled by fairly large companies who get little public sympathy. But there are lots of regular folk who've bought short-term Airbnbs as a stable, long-term investment. Now they risk losing a ton of money. Also, if we don't have short-term rentals, do we actually have enough hotel rooms to make up the difference? Our understanding, anecdotally through talking with our network, is no, we do not. So we'll follow up more with this debate on another Rumble Room, Robin, but let's now shift to another issue that's also upsetting a lot of people locally.
No kidding. It's a terrible situation, what's taking place in the Middle East, the conflict going on in Israel and Gaza. Unlike the war in Ukraine, where I would suggest a vast majority of Canadians strongly support the Ukrainians in their struggle to free themselves from the Russian invaders, the situation in the Middle East is not as clear-cut. For the record, John, both you and I believe that Israel has the right to exist. But, you know, there are others out there in the community that see Israel as an evil apartheid state, and some have even suggested it should be driven into the sea. And, you know, the have had situations now in both Victoria and Vancouver where demonstrators have come out supporting the Palestinians. Some of the speakers at those rallies are actually saying Israel deserves to be invaded and the Palestinians had their land stolen and therefore are justified in their anger and terrible, terrible violence. I'd suggest that the Palestinians today are actually suffering from mistakes made by their grandparents and great-grandparents long ago, back to 1947. At that time, the majority of people in what is today Israel were Arabs. In fact, it was a very mixed community. But the Arab countries, when Israel was declared a country in 1947 under the United Nations, a number of Arab countries surrounding Egypt, Jordan, Syria, they all invaded from different areas. They invaded Israel with the intention of destroying the Jewish people and ending the state. And as those armies moved forward, the Arabs living in much of Israel moved out. They didn't want to be in the middle of the war. They didn't want to be in the middle of the conflict. So they moved out of their homes to stand back and watch those armies take the day. Smoke clears, Israel wins the war, and Israel does not allow those Palestinians to return to their homes. Now, there were many Palestinians that stayed, and they're still there today. And they are, in fact, Israeli citizens. It's not as clear-cut. It's not black and white. And, relocating Palestinians to the states around them has also been an issue. Egypt doesn't want them. Jordan doesn't want them. Syria doesn't want them. The Palestinians deserve to have a state. They deserve to have a homeland. No argument from us. But Israel also deserves to have a state. So it's not black and white, and it's simplistic to say otherwise.
Outstanding context that is completely missing from the media dialogue today. Thank you very much, Robin. You know, Palestinians have lived on the margins for generations. So it's no wonder they're angry. and not a surprise that violent groups like Hamas have taken hold. Should Palestinians have homeland with full nationhood? Absolutely. Should Israel compromise to end settlements and expansion in order to win and facilitate peace? Absolutely. I wish we were hearing more of this at rallies. Anyway, let's see what our viewers have to say, because they are saying stuff, aren't they? Gary asks, do the Palestinian and their supporters in Canada support Hamas attacking and butchering innocent civilian Israeli men, women, and children, even babies?
And Gary also adds in his comments, Hamas has a mandate to destroy Israel and Jews. The Palestinians and their supporters support that. Now, those are a couple of comments. There's lots of comments that are along that same line. Many of them are much more inflamed, and some of them I don't think are appropriate to be repeating on the public airwaves of any kind. And so we're not going to do that, but there is certainly a lot of debate, pro and con, about Israel and the Hamas. And, you know, we have also spoken to local supporters of the Palestinians, and, you know, many of them also want to see the violence stop on both sides, but they still blame Israel. And there isn't much talk of compromise. So we decided to go to a neutral table and talk to a Middle East expert. Dr. Martin Bunton at the University of Victoria has great insight, has long studied this Middle Eastern conflict. Let's zoom him in. And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room for the first time is Dr. Martin Bunton, Associate Professor of History at the University of Victoria and a leading researcher, author, and lecturer on Middle Eastern history, particularly modern Middle Eastern history. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now, you've actually written a book, The Palestine-Israeli Conflict, a very short introduction. So obviously you've done a lot of work on this. You're well versed on the fractious history that's been going on between Israel and the Palestinians for time immemorial. You're also, I'm sure used to the ups and downs of that relationship. So were you particularly shocked at this ferocious outbreak in the Gaza region? And, was there actually a particular catalyst to all this?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. Because on the one side, one can't be that surprised of what many have referred to on October 7th as a prison break, that a population that had been in an open air prison, as it was often described, facing such a despairing situation with no real diplomatic horizon, and sort of locked into a very tragic pattern of rockets against Israel, Israeli bombardment of Gaza, 2008, 2014, 2021, causing tremendous destruction, but often followed by a ceasefire that was meant to kind of loosen a blockade that had been imposed on Gaza since 2007. That would last for a little while, and then there'd be another round of violence. So we all sort of knew that was not going to be very sustainable. Israeli leaders have called that mowing the lawn, a sort of sense in which Israeli leaders have become somewhat complacent almost in that status quo. But certainly the extent to which both operationally Hamas was able to break through those walls, and then the carnage, too, that took place when those Hamas fighters, militants, got into these civilian areas and opened fire. That certainly was a shock.
So great to have someone who join us, who understands the terrain in the Middle East. Much appreciated. So much disinformation is flying around all over the place. Thanks so much for joining us. We had Ezra Shankin from the Jewish Federation Greater Vancouver on the show a couple of weeks ago. He described this violence in Gaza as a proxy war, where Hamas served as a fist of Iran, which supplies the weapons and fuels the hatred towards Israel. Is Ezra correct? What's your opinion on this?
No, I don't think that's correct at all. Well, it's partially correct. Certainly, Iran has provided military arsenals. I think they've been doing that for years. But to suggest that the planning, the instructions, the motivation that all of this was anything other than, I think, long calculated by Hamas. I think an operation like this took some time. It also took tremendous secrecy. I'm not fully versed in military operational planning, but Israeli intelligence, we know, is extremely thorough, and Gaza is small. Does Iran stand to benefit from this? Yes. Has it seen Hamas as an ally over years, and has it supplied it with weapons? Yes. But is Hamas simply a puppet of Iran? No. And keep in mind, I think this is probably also relevant to any discussion that we might want to have about Hezbollah. So Hamas and Hezbollah can all be seen, I think, as part of what they would refer to as an or sort of a resistance axis, a resistance to what they see as American/Israeli plans for hegemony over the region. But a resistance axis is different than sort of all of these parties acting in unison. And I think if they were actually acting in unison, we would have seen more from Hezbollah and Iran by this point. And I don't think either Iran or Hezbollah are interested in a larger conflagration that everybody knows nobody can win.
There had been suggestions that Iran was unhappy that the Saudis were going to sign some sort of an agreement around mainly business, I think, and exchanges of goods, and they didn't want to see that. Now Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other, so that's an interesting twist as well. The Palestinians.
I'm sorry, I missed your earlier question about the timing, and that was also kind of been raised as a question of timing. To what extent were Saudi Arabia and Israel close to a normalization agreement, something that Biden has pushed for, and to what extent was Hamas looking to derail that? Again, I don't know how that factors into the planning, but to the extent that it does delay that, certainly Iran benefits.
To John's point, there's been a lot of accusations thrown out on both sides around the world. It's become quite the debate, and it's an angry debate, and a lot of it's on social media. The Palestinian supporters are screaming from the river to the sea, where I think they're saying from the Jordan River all the way to the ocean, they want to drive Israel into the sea, and they're saying this in a very angry way. We had Yitzhak Rabin quite a while ago now, when he was leading Israel, getting close, it seemed, to some sort of a settlement, at least with the West Bank and the Palestinians, and setting them up as an autonomous country, and maybe stopping the incursions of the settlements. And then Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. So, if that had happened, could have all of this been prevented?
Yeah, the classic could have, counterfactual history. So it is important because it reminds us that there are alternatives, that we're not on some sort of straight line trajectory, right? And so I don't think this is inevitable. And also, as you said earlier, there are twists and turns in history that we need to pay attention to. So yes, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO at the time, did reach some agreements. And there was tremendous promise at the time. There was a real hope that, as according to an international consensus and international resolutions, there would be a two-state solution. I think internationally, if you look at Canadian foreign policy, for example, that is still the plan, that is still the horizon, that is whether or not when you look at what's happened on the ground, one can still bring that about. A two-state solution isn't clear, but those plans did not reach any fruition. There is poor leadership on both sides. That was a big part of the problem. Another part of the problem was that at the same time as Israel was negotiating with the Palestinians over two states, Israel was at the same time settling the West Bank, which was meant to be part of the Palestinian state, with increasing numbers of Israelis. Right? So it raises an obvious tension at the outset. How do you settle the West Bank at the same time as prepare to exchange it for peace in preparation for an independent Palestinian state? And so for the last 10 or 15 years, there really haven't been any negotiations between the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership, Abbas, who is Arafat's successor. And what this has done to the Palestinian Authority, the regime that emerged from that process, is it's very much undermined it in the minds of Palestinians, because now it really doesn't, without any political horizon towards independence on the West Bank and Gaza, the PA doesn't, in the minds of many Palestinians, serve any purpose other than being co-opted by the Israeli occupying force to do kind of the security work in the West Bank. And that's part of what Hamas has tried to do, is reclaim that sense of resistance amongst Palestinians to a failed diplomatic process.
Hmm.
Yeah.
A lot of the Palestinians in Gaza have tried to escape to Egypt for safety.
Mhm.
Well, nowhere else to go. Egyptians, however, are keeping their gates locked. Why have other Muslim countries not tried to relocate and absorb the Palestinians over the years? Certainly, there's no shortage of oil-funded money to make this possible.
Mhm. That's an interesting question, right? So we've talked about this blockade that Israel imposed on Gaza since 2007, when actually at that point, elections were held in 2006. Hamas won them from the Palestinian Authority, defeated Abbas's party. There's a big rift, and since then, Hamas has been ruling there. Now, why Egypt has maintained that border and maintained that blockade has much to do with the geopolitics of the region. Yeah, the Egyptian government is highly dependent both upon its alliance with America for funding and support and with its treaty to Israel. So it's very much in the interests of the Egyptian leadership, not so much in the people, in the minds of the people, but the Egyptian government doesn't care about the people. It's been very clear over 10 years in terms of the very brutal authoritarian rule of a very economically inept government. Egypt's in trouble, you know. So there's that. There's the extent to which you have a government in place that's more interested in its own maintenance and its alliances in that sense. It's also a government that has a military government that has tremendous animosity against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and any alliance that it might have with Hamas, which is itself originally a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's that. But in terms of actually opening that gate, there's a long history here of trauma on both sides, right? We know how traumatic it was for Israel, for there to be a sort of pogrom-like attack in southern Israel. But we also know that for Palestinians who in 1947 to 49 and again in 1967 were subject to expulsions from Israel. So you have in Gaza a largely refugee population who fled or were forced out of their homes in 1949. There's that trauma of displacement that is not either going to that will be conjured up in any forced pressured move towards that border, but also would make Egypt think twice about being complicit in any attempt to see that again. Now, whether or not that's the case, you know, that Israel might say, "What are you saying? Of course they'll be allowed back to their homes." That's not the trauma. That's not the historical memory. Also, Egypt doesn't have necessarily have the resources to accommodate a million, hundreds of thousands of refugees in Sinai Peninsula. It's not like there's water resource. There's no resources there, right? And then the concern for Egypt and other countries would be that those refugees stay there, as they did in Jordan, as in Syria, as in southern Lebanon. And
it's interesting, you know, you're saying that the displacement that took place starting in 1947, I guess, with the original war when all the Arab countries lined up against Israel and Israel won, and that was unexpected. And a lot of Arabs took up arms against the Jewish community, and for that they were moved out of their homes. And yet there's I understand there's 1 million Arabs that are actually Israeli citizens that do live and operate and work in Israel. So it's not as black and white. I wonder, and I want to leave you with this, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I wonder whether this isn't a question of fundamentalism on both sides. It's really led us to this terrible situation. On the one side, we have fundamental Jewish communities that are demanding settlements, demanding that all of Israelis be able to expand into the old ancient Israel, and that it's somehow God's wish that they should have this land, irrespective of the fact that the Palestinians have been there for thousands of years as well. And on the other side of it, you have radical Muslim groups who want to annihilate and destroy Israel point blank. And it's very hard to move these two groups. And yet we had an Israeli president in Netanyahu who has actually played up to his fundamentalists, and that's what's kept him in power. So you wonder whether it isn't religious intolerance on both sides that sometimes is making the situation even worse.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I know we're running out of time, but it's a very important question and it's a very big question. But I really appreciate how you talked about playing up, because I think that these religious motivations are easily manipulated and by leaders when it plays into their hands, right? But you've pointed out something very interesting, and that is a sort of mirroring of extremist Jewish groups who want Palestine from, how did you put it, from the sea to the river, right? And extremist religious groups on the Palestinian side who want all the land from the sea to the river. And so it's sort of interesting to think about the extent to which these groups who view this land as given to them by God, right, in terms of, and thus no other religion or religious leadership could rule over it. And yet the land they're talking about is essentially a land called Palestine, which Britain and France carved out amongst themselves with their own red pens after World War I. So I don't know how you resolve this. Either they both believe that these European policymakers where their hand was driven by God to draw out this religious land, or they're also both very much modern political nationalist movements driven by the desire for control within this political entity defined by this modern state. So as a rule, I tend to think of religious motivations as being about the use to which religion can be put, often for nationalist or political purposes, than as religion per se. And my one last point about religious extremism is we know it thrives in chaos. We know it thrives in failed, destroyed states, as ISIS did, as you know, for that matter, Hezbollah emerges from the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Hamas emerges from the occupation of Gaza. So the antidote to this is some sort of, you know, a more stable, more safe, more secure, wealthier economic and political situation to emerge. And I don't know how that happens after this pulverization of Gaza. I really don't know what happens next.
Well, we'll certainly continue to follow this issue, Robin. Hopefully not for many, many, many years, but it might be. We pray the fighting will soon stop, and somehow peace can follow and emerge. But it looks like a terribly long, rocky road for the immediate future.
It's a terrible situation. It's generational, and how it will eventually end is anyone's guess. But on that note, we're going to shift topics again, John, and we're going to talk about something going on in BC. Provincial government has announced new immigration regulations, a new act that will make it easier for immigrants to come to Canada and work, either as temporary workers or those who are hoping to come and stay longer and build a new life here. And there are 29 professions covered by this act, but the biggest demand right now is in construction, hospitality, the service industry, of course, doctors and nurses. And many of these categories are, in fact, not covered by this new provincial law.
Yeah. What? Right? So we wanted to learn more about this from corporate immigration lawyer Ali Dadkhah, who is a partner with IMM Recruitment and a local legal firm in town. Let's zoom him in. Now, joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room is Ali Dadkhah, an immigration lawyer and partner with IMM Recruitment, an organization that assists qualified immigrants from around the world and the globe, the wide world, to find employment opportunities in Canada. Welcome back, Ali.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, totally. Lots of discussion about this topic all over the place. Such important work, as we simply need more skilled people to fill important jobs in this country, especially as baby boomers retire, i.e. me, potentially Robin, and people in Canada have been having smaller families. The provincial government has announced new measures to allow people with foreign qualifications to more easily come to Canada. I know this has been a big issue amongst the foreign recruitment community, and these folks potentially can come work to Canada without having to go back to school when they get here. How will this change your business?
Right now, before foreign workers getting a work permit and coming to Canada, they need to get their credential assessed. They need to get the right qualification. But they couldn't do that till they actually have a work permit and they're here. So one problem this legislation is trying to solve is this eliminating this catch-22 of requiring Canadian work experience prior to being accredited in Canada. But we need to look beyond this. This new legislation says this is going to affect 29 different professions. So we have to look a little bit deeper to see what those professions are. And I'm going to read a few of those professions to give a little more context to it. So here are some examples of it. So registered music teacher, professional engineer, land surveyor, lawyer, professional biologist, architect, notary public, accountant, associate real estate broker, managing real estate broker, your real estate representative. These are majority of the jobs being listed there. So we need to think a little bit deeper here.
So are these the sorts of jobs that were previously being covered by your organization? Were these the people you were commonly bringing to Canada? Or is this a new group of people that are qualified at a higher level? I mean, how has the business changed because of this? Who have you been bringing? What's been the demand? And now what do you see as the demand because the rules have changed?
Yeah. So what we have focused on is what BC needs the most. We are focused on occupations that are high on demand, or there's actually a shortage for them in BC. For instance, we all know BC is a province dependent highly on hospitality, restaurant, and hotels. Right now, one of the major issues we have is supply chain issue. We need more truck drivers to deliver food to these businesses. There's a shortage of them. We don't see any truck drivers on that list. The other one is, as we all know, we have a housing crisis now. We need more houses. We need more, sure, there are going to be more funding as federal government has made few announcements and provincial government too, but we still need people to build those houses. We need trade occupations. We need carpenters. We need drywallers. We need roofers. None of those trade occupations are actually listed on that on what's been proposed by the act. So what's going to be the actual impact of it? How it's going to impact our business? Not by much, because most of the jobs we are bringing into Canada are the jobs that are actually going to, it's what's actually at the labor shortage in BC. Those jobs listed there, we don't see that many of them. They do come. It's the legislation is a good positive. It's a step to the right direction. But how is actually going to benefit BC? I mean, how many more? I mean, there are some good professions on that list too. Don't get me wrong. There are like social workers, but what actually BC needs the most, it's not on that list. There is one more sector we've seen more recently in BC that there's a higher demand for it, and that's jobs associated with maritime. Like we have few industries in even on the island that are being heavily reliant on jobs related to maritime, and so we've seen kind of like a higher demand there. Other than that, across other provinces, we've seen a similar level of consistency in terms of what sort of job we've seen increased demand for them: hospitality and construction.
I sincerely hope the British Columbia government is listening to this constructive analysis of this new act and will do something about expanding its umbrella to welcome more immigrants that are badly needed in various sectors of the economy where they have a serious shortage. Let's face it, this is a problem. And we'll just see how that all goes. And on that happy note, John, time to wrap up another show.
Yeah, hard to believe that we could actually wrap up a show that talks about so many critical issues in our community and around the world. Anyway, I found it very, very informative. Thank you, Robin, for some of the background. Very, very helpful. And I'm quite sure our viewers are enjoying what we deliver on the Rumble Room. We've heard that, and we appreciate that. Always something different, and hopefully something new. We've now we have crossed 1.4 million cumulative viewers to our program. Hey, how are you all doing out there? Hello. We hear you since we started this project, and we very much appreciate your support and enjoy hearing from you. Keep telling us your thoughts. Please encourage your friends and families to follow the show. Of course, there are many ways in which you can do that to see the Rumble Room. There's Facebook, There's Twitter or X. All of our interviews and clips are on YouTube. We're also very active in Facebook news groups, those that choose to post our views. Of course, we're on Instagram. We are on TikTok. And we also have a sponsorship page in case you want to help us reach even more people. We'd appreciate that. For now, I remain your Croatian sensation, Yanni Juricic.
And John, I just have to add one small thing because it's a local show too. It's fascinating to me that we could have had a sting operation recently in Victoria where they arrested a huge group of people that were shoplifting throughout Greater Victoria, ravaging our downtown. And nobody stays in jail. They're all released, and a couple of them are actually getting caught the next day doing the same thing. We have a mess. We'll talk more about that on a future show. But for now,